Fred Ross.
Fred Ross.
Fred Ross. Fred Ross.
Fred Ross.
Fred Ross Sr. and Fred Ross Jr.
When you do work in civic engagement, what you do is you make history. That's what Fred Ross taught us, how to make history.
All right, well, welcome back to Legal AF with the Midas Touch Network. We're here talking today about the importance of organizing in this moment as we're seeing sort of hour by hour lawlessness by this administration, the failure to follow court orders, efforts to respond to what's happening in Congress, the failure of Congress to stand up to this president, town halls where people are speaking up and getting arrested for daring to even boo some of these members. Now is a great time to really talk about the importance of organizing in the block and build strategies that my partner at Court Accountability Action, Alex Aronson, has really been trying to push forward as how we meet this moment, how we block and how we build. So Alex and I are really happy to invite to the show today John Heffernan, who has put together an amazing film on one of the key organizers in the 20th century, Fred Ross. And so, John, do you want to tell us a little bit about the film? And then Alex may have the first question to you, I bet.
Sure. Well, thank you, Lisa. I am so pleased to be here because I get to talk about this film, which is called American Agitators. We didn't know what to call the film for a long time. For a while, it was called the Fred Ross Project. What it is about is demonstrating the power of organizing, of grassroots organizing, told through the story of Fred Ross, who organized in the Dust Bowl camps in the 1930s and the Japanese-American internment camps in the 40s, and he mentored Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And then the story goes on to tell about contemporary organizers, people who are more or less standing on Fred's shoulders and creating change through organizing today.
That's amazing, John. And it feels so timely. One thing I've been thinking a lot about, and on this program, we talk a lot about the courts and the rule of law and efforts by authoritarian networks to capture, control, and weaponize the courts against us to take back so much of the progress that organizers like Fred Ross were able to achieve in the 20th century. And it strikes me that, on some level, Americans in this sort of sense of American exceptionalism feel like we've made this progress and we can't lose it, right? Our institutions will hold these core freedoms and rights that others have worked so hard and sacrificed to achieve. They're ours now as if by some entitlement. And that's not the case. I think we're seeing that every day of this terrifying administration, that these are vulnerable and fragile, and it reminds us of how hard fought they were. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about why you chose this moment, why Fred Ross, why are these lessons about the importance of organizing so critical in a moment like this?
Sure. Well, as I said, Fred Ross Sr. and then his son, who carried on his father's legacy, he himself being a iconic organizer in California and across the country, organized with the backdrop of fascism and Nazism and McCarthyism in some very, very difficult periods. But he was able to create long-term systemic change largely through the power of vote. Yes, we do talk about, particularly today, the fragility of democracy. And, I spent time in the former Yugoslavia. Nobody ever thought that what happened there in the 1990s would ever happen. But I think we do need to face that. But I do think that by grassroots organizing, you create a kind of a systemic change, if you will, a sustainable change, a long-term change that is far more powerful than organizing, let's say, through social media. It's something where it sticks, if you will. It's not a quick fix. And Fred was able to do that.
Yeah, I was really interested, John, in when I was reading about Fred and his organizing, sort of the roots of that, going back to John Steinbeck, one of my favorite authors, and the novel The Grapes of Wrath, and how, Fred was right there in those farming communities, in those communities with those migrant workers who were facing, so many challenges in terms of their own economic, the fragile economic circumstance the country was in, but also in a very repressive American society at that time that now in some ways we're really hearkening back to. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about those roots, the roots of really trying to make sure that people in those circumstances had the right to vote for unionization and also to vote in our elections. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think probably the most powerful story about Fred organizing during those times, and in fact, he did organize in the Dust Bowl camps in the 1930s, but he also organized in places like Orange County, California, where there was a huge Mexican American community, and there was schools were segregated, and so he brought together Mexican American parents and organized them per se to file a lawsuit against Orange County, California, in which later became Mendez versus Westminster, which really set the groundwork, if you will, or laying the foundation for Brown versus the Board of Education. So he took these marginalized communities, and he didn't go in. It wasn't like this white savior complex, if you will, but it was largely listening to what people's problems were and creating this change by getting buy-in from those people who were affected by what it is to be marginalized in their communities.
And John, where would he take an organizing project like that? Where would he take it from there? He's building this community, he's building buy-in and trust around these challenges and putting together an organizing plan. Where would it go from there to actually affect change in pursuit of this agenda, to speak truth to power, to build coalition outside of the individualized affected community, to build political support? How did he see that organizing challenge?
Yeah, I think it was sort of ground up, if you will, grassroots organizing. I think that he saw that you needed to get buy-in, and you needed to establish a leadership. A lot of it was about organizing for power, if you will, or leadership within the community. So he was, not largely, but significantly responsible for getting the first Latino elected Ed Roybal to Congress in the Los Angeles area. So he saw the power of politics. He saw the power of law, but he also saw the power of what it took to from a grassroots perspective, get these people elected and get them into positions of power.
I was going to ask you, John, because like Alex and I, you also worked in Congress in addition to, as a staffer, in addition to your other work. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about your perspective on these different areas of work that you've had and how that informed your vision for this film and your vision for the moment we're facing right now, including that time in the dark days of Yugoslavia during that civil war.
Yeah, and there is no doubt that these are dark days right now. And I think, having this foundation as an organizer, as a young person, I didn't realize until later on in life, in fact, until I was involved in making this film, that almost everything that I've done in my life as a human rights advocate, as an activist, has been informed by being trained as an organizer. That it's about, Fred established and in fact wrote a book called Axioms for Organizers. I have this little book right here. And it's just little tidbits that might seem pretty simple, but I think to remind yourself that, for instance, 90% of organizing is follow-up, that reminding is critical, that listening is critical. He used to say a good organizer is a social arsonist that goes around setting people on fire. So it's really about inspiring people and making you realize that you don't need to be a Fred Ross. You don't need to be a Dolores Huerta or a Cesar Chavez to organize in your community, and whether that means for the stop sign at the end of the street or whether that means for racial justice.
One of the things I really liked in the trailer, and obviously it's coming out a little bit in this conversation, is the extent to which Ross was really intentional about leadership development. And it wasn't, I don't think Fred Ross is a household name in the way that some of the people that he helped become real leaders, right? He trained them and gave them some of these tools. People like Chavez and Huerta. It strikes me, we also spend a lot of time looking at the right wing power structure and this infrastructure and dark money network that they've developed, which has a huge pipeline development, leadership development, job placement component. What did you glean about the way he approached this challenge? Right, not kind of leading from the front, but rising up from the bottom again to build leaders that can advance this agenda for their own communities.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% that we could take a lesson from the playbook on the right in terms of what they're organizing very, very effectively. And I think more than anything, what I learned from Fred is the power of listening, and I can't overestimate that enough. I mean, he was not somebody who would be up front. He would be in the back of the room, but he would empower people. Dolores Huerta once said, she said, bringing Fred's life about this film, and she's in this film, bringing Fred's life to the screen is the medicine that this country needs right now, that he empowered people to engage in the democratic process.
Yeah, one of the things I really think about in thinking about organizing is, on the one hand, it's about the practical reality that people are facing, the challenges that individuals are facing in their daily life. And on the other hand, it's about this bold, determination, this optimism that in fact we can change things. And indeed, we must change things. And so I wonder, if you could tell us a little bit about the film and its debut, the award, I think it recently won,
Sure.
and where things are headed next.
Yeah, sure. No, you can have the best film in the world, right? But if nobody sees it, then what's the point? So we have this, what I call a pretty good or effective, so far, robust impact campaign that's led by a bunch of organizers like myself. I mean, talk about low-hanging fruit. If the people that made this film, who are involved in this film, who are now in our 60s and 70s, who were trained by Fred Ross, can't organize people to see it, then we're really screwing up. So this impact campaign includes the festival circuit. We did win Best Documentary at the Cinequest Film Festival in San Jose, California, and in fact, just last night we won the Best Documentary at the Poppy Jasper Film Festival in Hollister, San Juan Bautista. So we're doing, as they say, the film festival circuit, but we're also reaching out to large conferences in December. We'll be screening the film at the National Council for Social Studies here in Washington, D.C., that brings together thousands of teachers, again, looking for those kind of multiplier effects. We're also in partnership with the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, and NEA, the two large teachers unions, creating a curriculum for kindergarten through 12, largely middle school, high school kids, as well as creating training manuals for unions. Labor has been incredibly helpful in terms of supporting this film. So the idea is, how do we get this in front of the target audience of people? I want the person who's always wanted to organize for change, but didn't, really know how to do it. And so what this film does, it's not a how-to film per se, but it does show you what are sort of the methodology of organizing. And the last third of the film is really about people who are organizing today, who are more or less standing on the shoulders of Fred Ross.
John, could you walk us through a couple of those modern day organizers and what you see them doing before we let you go? That sounds like a really important.
Yeah, I mean, so we have a wonderful Kampala is her name, who's the head of the Oakland Teachers Association in Oakland, California, who organized her fellow union members to negotiate a contract that that ended up getting almost everything. you never get everything that you want. There's always going to be compromises. But she did it simply by knocking on the door. And it turns out with her entourage, it turns out that she was trained as an organizer by Fred Ross. We have people with Unite 15 in Atlanta who are in the film. Again, these are people who, some of them, Kampala was unusual that she knew Fred, but most of them didn't know Fred. But in a sense, as I said, they're standing on her shoulders and they're using the techniques that Fred perfected. The house meeting is something that Fred used all the time. And in fact, one of his first house meetings was at the home of Helen and Cesar Chavez, in San Jose, California. And Chavez was skeptical. He said, "Who is this tall white guy coming in my house telling me what to do?" By the end of the meeting, he understood that, in fact, Fred had something to share, and he had some value in terms of, improving the lives of people who had been, severely marginalized in the community.
Wow. Well, the film is American Agitators, and John, it's just so wonderful for you to come on and share these stories, and then make this film to share these stories as widely as possible. And Alex, it's a joy working with you, because I think not only are you a great thinker and a great and wonderful ally, but also because you have this training as an organizer. It just makes an enormous amount of difference in what we're trying to accomplish here in advancing justice and responding to this crisis with the John Roberts Court and more. So I hope that Fred Ross becomes as well-known and more well-known in some ways than Saul Alinsky. I hope this film helps introduce multiple generations to the power of organizing the way he taught it, and the power of us, we the people, to change things. So with that, we'll wrap. And thank you all for joining Legal AF on the Midas Touch Network. Please like and subscribe and share. And please come back, John, as this film makes its way around the country. And if folks want to help hold a screening in your town, you can contact the website. We'll place that information in this video. And thank you, Alex. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
This was a century that exposed the ugly American. Fred Ross, to the total contrary point, was the beautiful American. He was the American who came out to the barrios, who came out to the labor camp, and put himself on the line.
A good organizer is a social arsonist who goes around setting people on fire. And he wanted to help set that fire, turn on the switch, provide the spark. He was always on the lookout for men and women who had to do something about injustice. And Caesar's position was, we can train the organizers. Fred Ross can train the organizers, and we'll get it done.
He would sit us down. He would start teaching us about how to communicate the message on why it mattered that they should vote for the Farm Workers Union.
What is it that Fred Sr. said? Lighting people on fire. This is what it's about.
Fred taught us politicians are our servants.
Fred Ross Jr. has celebrated his father's legacy by continuing to organize the community.
Fred Ross.
Fred Ross.
Fred Ross. Fred Ross.
Fred Ross.
Fred Ross Sr. and Fred Ross Jr.
When you do work in civic engagement, what you do is you make history. That's what Fred Ross taught us, how to make history.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.